I wanted to go through this talk and explain what is genetic testing, what it's for, why it's useful, why it's valuable, and to give people an opportunity to know more about the different types of testing. So who I am is that I'm a Fitgenes practitioner, I'm an ebook author, I'm an acupuncturist in New Zealand, a chiropractor, licensed chiropractor in the US and New Zealand, and extra training in functional neurology, and my website, drsamshay.com. And I got into natural medicine because of my own history, which we can talk about a little bit later. But what I do is that I work with people who are dealing with mystery fatigue, stress, and toxic illnesses, genetic testing, as well as a lot of functional testing. And a lot of people come to me because they're confused around diet, where we're dealing with their weight, or gut sensitivity, or blood sugar problems, or gluten sensitivity, or feeling inflamed, or foggy brain. And they're challenged by all these different types of diets, having the cycles of fatigue, feeling hungry very quickly after meals, digestive problems, post-meal lethargy, chronic inflammation, waking in the middle of the night, sugar cravings. And I've been through those things myself. And the reason I'm talking about everything that I'm doing is because I've been through all these different types of chronic health problems that people struggle with. Whether it's insomnia, digestion issues, chronic pain, sugar addiction, hungry all the time, multiple diets, and just all sorts of stuff that I had to deal with. And there's a new approach that's available now. It's genetic testing, where you can actually check for vulnerabilities and make specific preemptive as well as preemptive maneuvers in terms of your lifestyle, nutrition, and diet to help prevent or delay the expression of bad variants on a gene. Or if you're experiencing something that's unpleasant right now, then the genetics testing may be able to reveal as to why it's going on, and more importantly, what you can do about it. There's a concept called health expectancy versus life expectancy, and this is coming straight out of the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare report. And health expectancy is when people are disease-free, and life expectancy is when health expectancy ends, is when people have a disability or a disease that significantly impairs one's quality of life, whether it's neurodegenerative like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, a metabolic issue like cancer or autoimmune diseases, and so forth. So in Australia, men live about 17.5 years on average from the point they develop a disability or disease. Women, it's about 20 years. And the only way to really shift this needle forward, because people want to live a long health expectancy and not necessarily a long life expectancy, because no one really would want to live with a with a chronic issue going on. I don't know if my video is actually functioning based on what's being viewed on Facebook Live, but anyway, we'll just soldier on. So the only way to really push that needle forward so you can live all the way up as far as you can, like this gentleman here on the left, he died on a surfboard in his 90s, which is where we want to be, versus this gentleman here, as you can see, is just chronically decaying and is living a life of life expectancy as opposed to health expectancy. So what we have is genetics, and genetics interacts with lifestyles, nutrition, it's exercise, and they all interact and talk to each other. And there's a new field of study called nutrigenomics, where it's not just your genes affecting you, but it's actually how you behave in terms of your exercise, your mental state, and the food you consume actually affects how your genes express. And that your genes aren't your destiny, they're probabilities, in the sense that your genes will always default back to their set point, but your lifestyle can dial them up or dial them down accordingly. There's, out of Australia, this is a 2009 report, is saying that genetics contributes to 70% of someone's body weight, and we'll come to that in a moment. It's explaining why. We're going to put a special focus on inflammatory-based weight gain, because a lot of people are struggling to lose weight and can't. A lot of it's actually genetic, and even if they have good fat metabolism genes, the genes they have off that are not imbalanced, but they just have unfavorable variants on them is actually the inflammatory genes, and they just swell up with water retention to fight the inflammation. So there's many factors that affect health expectancy. So we've got exercise, food, smoking, alcohol, drugs, stress, environmental factors like pollution. But now there's the interaction of the genes. And we can modify our gene expression, because every time we go to dinner, we not only bring our appetite, but we also bring our genes. So, like I said before, you've got your genes, which are your set point, but there's a dimmer switch where things can be dialed up or dialed down, depending on your lifestyle, which is a good thing, because we can actually control that. So, here's a disclaimer. It's a powerful tool, but you gotta work ideally with a clinician and not just rely on what your variants are. Having a clinician be able to interpret this is really, really critical. A lot of people get super confused and overwhelmed if they get a 23andMe report, which, by the way, I can convert the 23andMe into the Fitgenes paradigm, how they organize the data. But if you get like just a giant readout of your genes, you're going to run into problems most likely of just overwhelm, of feeling like there's just too many things to do, they're not prioritized, they're not properly organized. And it's just really a problem. People get too overwhelmed with so many things. And what we can do is actually, a clinician can actually take the data and cater it to you based on your specific lifestyle and fit it to your needs. And how do we determine what your needs are? Well, we've got this model, which is the one I put together, called the 10 Pillars of Health. And this is the model that I use clinically to assess lifestyle. Genes fits in this model brilliantly, because genes are everything that is done in lifestyle is interpreted through your genes, and how you act also affects the genes. So these are the 10 pillars of health. I developed these working with chronically unwell patients back 8 years ago, and I've been using this model ever since. And this is about but the reason why there's 10 is because I found people who are chronically unwell have a minimum of 7 out of 10 pillars that are crumbling, either chronically or acutely, or some combination. So the 10 pillars are the brain and hormone system. This is adrenals, thyroid, gonadal hormones, left-right brain balance. Bowel is, are you pooping regularly? And your digestion, are you digesting properly? Physical body is unresolved injuries, misalignments, poor posture, bad dental work, accidents, as well as genes, the physical body and the genes therein. Burst is exercise, whether high-intensity interval training or walking or movement patterns, and I look at if it's too much, too little, or the wrong type. Biotoxins is everything bad from you, from pollution in the air, water, and food, toxic chemicals you may be exposed to from industry or hobbies or your job, to toxic chemicals in food, preservatives, sprays, and so forth. Nutrients is everything you need to eat. That's all the nutrients, fats, proteins, carbs, specific types, like vitamins, minerals, and I put sunlight, oxygen, and water there. Breakfast is not only your starting meal, but also routines. Some of the most unwell people I've ever worked with have been shift work nurses. They're very, very unwell for many reasons due to the work environment they're in, but one of the major ones is the shift work and just totally messing up their circadian rhythms. Bothers is another word for stress, whether it's financial stress, emotional stress, marital stress, job stress. Clutter is a form of stress. Some people are sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Many people aren't, but some are. That's a form of stress. Stress takes many, many forms. And bugs is your relationship with all things microscopic, whether it's a parasitical infection in the gut, or a fungal infection, or bacterial infection, or even beneficial bacteria just being out of balance, or it's mold, whether it's mold in your environment, mold at work, mold in the house. Mold can devastate people. So bugs is, a lot of people ask why isn't bugs with bowels, because it's actually bigger than just digestion and gut health, and primarily because of the mold issue. Because mold doesn't necessarily have to be in the bowel. Mold can be in the building and cause you tremendous problems. Bedtime is sleep. So quality, duration, consistency, depth. So those are the 10 pillars. Now to contextualize them, in relation to your genes, this is the complete cycle of chronic disease. And what's happening is that you've got bad life choices, bad life circumstances are the underlying cause. These are the 10 pillars of health. Now, bad choices versus circumstance. If you're like a 6-year-old child and you're being fed constipating food, you're slouched over all the time in front of a television screen, video games, or school, you're not exercising properly, you're being given pretty toxic foods and processed foods like SpaghettiOs and the microwave like crappy ramen noodles and sodas and candy bars and etc. And these bad foods and desserts and candies and breakfast cereals are replacing real food that like vegetables and animal proteins and animal fats and so forth. Not getting the right nutrients. Breakfast is like a bagel with I can't believe it's not butter and fake cheese and like soy cheese and just other and things that are inflammatory and things like that. And they're very stressed out because of stress at the house or bullying at the school. There's a chronic infection from, say, swimming at a summer camp lake and not having it properly diagnosed and treated, and being a chronic insomniac because of the anxiety of school and what's going on. Now, and a hormonal imbalance from all the stress, putting the adrenals out of whack. Now, if I've just described what I went through as a child and why I went through a 12-year period of being very, very, very unwell. And it wasn't really necessarily choices. At 6 years old, it's not about choices, it's about circumstance. Like sometimes it's just bad circumstance. And so your choices and circumstances interpreted through your genes lead to what's called an adaptive response. So this is where the genes live. These green arrows are all genes. So people can have the exact same carbon copy circumstance or choices, but they get different results because of their genetic variants. So people can have one or a combination of these adaptive responses: inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation, free radicals or tissue breakdown. Then chronic adaptation plus genetics equals damage to the three main body systems: liver, gut health, and hormones. Chronic breakdown through your genetics equals symptoms: fatigue, low mood, indigestion, weight gain, craving, insomnia, chronic pain. For women in middle age, hot flashes. Symptoms plus coping equals bad choices. So doing things to cope with symptoms, whether it's comfort food or bad habits or staying up late or whatever it may be, leads to more adaptive responses, more damaged body symptoms, more symptoms, and round it goes. So this is how genetics interplays with people's chronic diseases or just simply poor health or non-perfect health, whether it's like these 10 pillars in this genetics model applies to aspirational biohackers as it does to people with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. So this is where genetics influences everything, and one of the major things that genetics can clarify is diet. Now, there's a lot of different types of diets. These are about the 15 major ones. Vegan, lacto-vegetarian, lacto-ovo, pescatarian, which is fish, albitarian, which is a word I made up, is people who only eat white meat and pork but don't eat red meat. And then there's lots of variations in here. A lot of people don't eat pork but will eat red meat, on and on. Paleolithic, slow-carb, ketogenic, Mediterranean blood type, Atkins, metabolic, gluten-free, FODMAPs, and Weston A. Price. There's all sorts of different diets, but the question is like, how do you know what your macronutrient profile is? And you can figure that out through your genetics. So low carb. So Fitgenes has what's called a AMY1 test, or CarbChoice, and this is a really, really amazing test. This test changed my life because I'd been struggling for over 2 decades with very embarrassing digestive problems. And what happened was that I was I was teaching nutrition for 15 years at that point. And then I did this test and I realized that I wasn't gluten intolerant, even though I had basically a perfect diet. Everything was local, I knew my farmers, it was all organic, I knew where stuff came from. And if I was having grains, they were gluten-free and organic, and I soaked them, and then did all the proper things first, like soaking and sprouting the quinoa, blah, blah, blah. But still, I had really bad digestive problems. And it turns out that I had a carb tolerance, very, very low carb tolerance. In fact, I had a 2, which is the second lowest carb tolerance you can have. And within 1 week of just reducing the number of carbs for my unique genetics, my digestive problems went away after over 2 decades of suffering. And again, I've been teaching nutrition for 15 years, so this really kind of blew my mind. And to give a sense of what is actually going on, is that people have what's called an AMY1 gene. It stands for amylase, which is the main enzyme to help break down carbs in the saliva. This isn't about variations of amylase gene, because the variations on the AMY1 gene make very, very little difference to the amount of amylase secreted. What does make a big difference is the number of copies of this gene. So imagine your body is a fort with various carb cannons that shoot out little Pac-Man. And every cannon is 1 copy of the gene. So if you've got 2 copies of that gene, you're spitting out 2 Pac-Men at a time. Whereas if you've got 9+ cannons, you're able to handle way more carbs that are coming at you than if you just got 2. So this is the best way that I can kind of picture it, is that if you're a low carb tolerance, you can't actually handle large amounts of carbs because you don't have the genetic grunt to deal with it. Now, what you can do is, once you get your carb choice number, is dial in your carbohydrate levels. So some people genuinely are high carb. They're rare, but they do exist. A lot of people are in the middle, like moderate, whether it's like 5 to 8. These are approximately the Mediterranean type diets. The 2 to 4s are approximately paleo, and the 1s are approximately the ketogenic people. 1 to 2s maybe be ketogenic. Like, I do really well on a high-fat diet, but I don't, I can still handle a very, very tiny amount of carbs. So this is carb choice, and once you have this number in mind, and it's really practical. Like, I use the finger rule, which is something I constructed to help people remember. If you're at 2, like I am, I can have 2 fingers worth of carbs maximum per meal. And there's a difference between hard carbs and soft carbs. So hard carbs are grains, potatoes, and fleshy sweet fruits like mangoes, pineapples, melons, pears, nectarines, and so forth. Soft carbs, again, this is my jargon, are things like carrots and beets and pumpkins and yams and like sour fruits, Granny Smith apples, sour cherries, and I would put berries in this category as well, even though they can be very sweet. They're so high nutrition and relative to the amount of sugar that I think I put them in the soft carb. And so basically I let people double the amount of soft carbs relative to their hard carbs. So people can have 2 fingers worth maximum, if there are 2, like me, of, say, rice at a meal. As you can see, it's not that much. And the fingers scale with the size of the person, so it kind of works. Or I can have 4 fingers worth of soft carbs. And it's just a really easy way to remember. Now, that's the carb choice number. Then we're going to talk about that's the carb choice test. Then there's the 58 gene test that Fitgenes offers. And the 58 gene test is really amazing because what it does is it actually looks at the drivers of diseases, not the diseases themselves. So it's looking at things like inflammation, free radical damage, liver detoxification, vitamin D metabolism, vitamin D absorption rather, methylation, which is a buzzword in the genetics world, cardiovascular health, and fat and energy metabolism. And what they do, as you can see, is they cluster the genes accordingly by their drivers, not just randomly separated. Because then you can look at patterns and see, is there a cluster? So, for example, let's look at inflammation. The role of inflammation is to deal with defense, is to deal with an injury and to deal with an infection. So if you have too much inflammation, that's bad. If you have no inflammation, that's also bad. So some people, what you want is a little bit of inflammation that comes on quickly, deals with the infection and injury, and then goes away. The problem is that if you have an overly aggressive response, or you have too much inflammation, or you have chronic inflammation like hot coals that just constantly simmer in the background and create problems long term. Then people have issues with their anti-inflammatory genes potentially. Like, do you have a fire hose or a squirt gun? So you can have lots of inflammation, but if you have really, really good anti-inflammatory genes, you're able to put them out. But people with very poor anti-inflammatory genes can't put out the fire just with a dinky little squirt gun. So people who have a poor anti-inflammatory genetic variance combined with a lot of pro-inflammatory variants leads to lots and lots of chronic inflammation. And these are the people who constantly gain weight. The people that just, quote, look at food and gain 4 pounds or 2 pounds or whatever. And it's not that there's calories for the 2 pounds in the food, or even the weight of the food is 2 pounds. It's that the food triggers an inflammatory response in which the body retains water in order to dilute the toxic inflammatory chemicals. The solution to pollution is dilution. So what happens is that if you've got chronic inflammation, and you eat something inflammatory, it's only going to add fuel to the fire, so you're just going to swell up with water in order to dilute the inflammation. And here's a real example. Like this is someone that I've worked with, and this person has had chronic weight gain that she just cannot shed for decades. Just been overweight, can't get rid of it, tried all sorts of different diets, as well as is dealing with chronic pain in her joints. And as you can see, of the first 12 pro-inflammatory genes, she has 11 out of 12 had unfavorable variants. So green is very good, yellow is not good, red is really bad. So overinflame, inflame can kind of stop this one gene in the liver, but just definitely just a massive overinflammation. So she over-initiates and perpetuates inflammation. On top of that, she's got 3 squirt guns for anti-inflammatory genes, no fire hoses. So what that means is that she's really, not only does she overproduce inflammation, but she has trouble putting it out. This is why she just swells when she eats food, particularly carbs, or just anything, the slightest thing that can trigger her to gain weight, even though it's a small thing. It doesn't make sense why until you look at this. This is actually her 15 genes in situ, so to speak, like situated within the inflammatory pathway. So IL-1 is the big initiator, so she way over-initiates, red, yellow, and then it goes in, and TNF-alpha is ramped up, and interleukin-6. And what's interesting is that interleukin-6 will ramp up production of fat cells. But fat cells will create their own interleukin-6, which then creates some more fat cells, and round it goes. And then it's only cleared here, but there's a block here, and all these other parts are also affected. So she just massively overinflames. And what happens, like this is a comparison of 5 pounds of fat to 5 pounds of muscle. And the problem is that fat gain of this nature has so many health implications. Now, what's really interesting is that when I looked at her genes for her inflammatory process, so like here's her inflammatory genes, these 15, you can see these 14 out of 15 had bad variants on it. When I looked at her free radical status, these are actually really good. This is the second best type you can have. The best would be all 3. Her liver genes had 5 out of 8 variants here, particularly the GSTP1, which is a really major control for estrogen, as well as HO-1, and this one is really connected to the inflammatory cycle, and she's got 2 red dots in her vitamin D receptors. So vitamin D is misnamed, it's actually a hormone. Vitamin D is massively anti-inflammatory, massively. So I would actually lump these with the inflammatory genes. So she's got a really bad dice roll when it comes to inflammation, which explains why she's in a lot of pain and why she's gaining all this weight that she can't lose easily. And what's more interesting is that when I look at her fat and energy metabolism genes, you can look here, it's pretty good. I mean, relative to everything else especially. Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 of these 14 genes have green dots. So just on balance, she's overweight not because of her fat metabolism, she's overweight because of inflammation. And so what I'm doing with her is a really strong anti-inflammatory profile. Not a calorie restriction, but anti-inflammatory nutrients, anti-inflammatory lifestyle, anti-inflammatory diet. That it's about inflammation. We're focusing, based on her genetics, about inflammation. And then there's a lot of complexity here in terms of what can be done. Like, because each one of these genes, when you look at them, they're all clustered together. The interventions, like, I'm not going into a lot of detail of the interventions, what the anti-inflammatory lifestyle is, but the anti-inflammatory lifestyle is based around what does the research show that, what is the fewest number of things that can be done to change the expression of these genes all at the same time. So I'm not giving her 27 or 40 separate recommendations. It's like, what's the handful that shift the expression of these genes in a beneficial way? So what does that mean? So what does that mean in terms of how can you shift them in a beneficial way? Because if it's a red dot always stay a red dot, the answer is yes. This is their default setting. And so what you can do is, by changing the default setting, you can actually shift you can make the red dots and yellow dots behave greenish. Greenish. They will always be red or yellow, but you can change their behavior with correct discipline of lifestyle to change how they express themselves. But if you don't do that consistently, then they will default back to their red or yellow status. They will never shift into a green. You can just change their behavior to make them act nicer. That's all. So other things I want to say is, a lot of people in genetics get really hung up on methylation. And I just want to say that methylation, most people fixate on this one gene right here. And I just want to point out that there's actually 9 genes involved. So a lot of people are getting bamboozled into fixating on one gene. And as you can see, there's way more than just that one gene. And especially since the inflammatory genes and liver genes and vitamin D receptor genes and so forth actually control this whole cycle as a whole. So this whole structure is actually prioritized. The inflammatory genes have the greatest level of control, including over methylation. So the focus for people, I'm not focusing on methylation with her, I'm focusing on anti-inflammation with her, because the inflammation is controlling methylation to a very large degree. So just to review, we're talking about health expectancy versus life expectancy, and this is the cycle of chronic disease. And as you can see, your genetics are the really critical junction point that interprets your choices and circumstances, that interprets the effects of the 4 adaptive responses, and that interprets just how much of a breakdown creates which type of symptoms. So this is where genetics is connected, and we have the technology today to check for genetics. And then if you've got 23andMe already, you can convert, or I can convert the 23andMe report into this structure, okay? Because 23andMe doesn't have this structure, okay? This is a Fitgenes structure, and it also connected to the back-end software to help identify which lifestyle choices are the most efficient to shift the expression of these genes.